There is a difference between chaos and crisis. Chaos is loud. Crisis is quiet. Right now, the Whittaker family is standing in something that feels less like internet drama and more like a turning point. Not because of a single video, not because of one accusation, but because the ground beneath them has shifted. And when the ground shifts under people who have lived the same way for 70 years, the impact is not small. It is structural. For decades, Betty and Larry lived a life that followed a simple rhythm. Wake up, make breakfast, do laundry, hang clothes on the line, cook dinner, sit on the porch, repeat. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't modern, but it was familiar. Familiarity is a form of safety. The world later saw that porch and judged it. The yard, the house, the peeling paint, the clutter, the laundry lines always full. But what most people missed was routine. Betty's mornings were predictable. She said it herself more than once. She cooked breakfast. She did laundry. Every day. The clothesline wasn't a symbol of neglect. It was proof of repetition, of habit, of continuity. And continuity matters. Now that continuity is broken. And here's the uncomfortable truth. When continuity breaks for vulnerable people, it doesn't just feel inconvenient. It feels destabilizing. The public conversation has been loud. Allegations, counter-allegations, abuse claims, manipulation claims, coaching claims, exploitation debates, state involvement, removals. But under all of that noise is one central question. Were they unsafe? For 70 years, nobody removed them. For 70 years, no emergency interventions split the family apart. Doctors saw them monthly for heart medication. That part has been repeated consistently. Betty, Lorraine, Timmy, regular appointments, refills, monitoring. If someone were sitting in urine all day, a doctor would notice. If someone had untreated sores, rashes, infections, those would be documented. Mandated reporters exist for a reason. And yet, for decades, no removal. Then suddenly removal. That abrupt shift is what makes this moment the hardest yet. Because the hardest part isn't the allegations. It isn't the YouTube arguments. It isn't even the state's involvement. It's the separation. People underestimate what separation does to cognitively vulnerable adults. Timmy sitting on the porch coloring. Ray sitting beside, familiar voices. Lorraine lighting up when someone she recognized arrived. Betty knowing who needed what without explanation. Those rhythms weren't accidental. They were learned over a lifetime. When someone says, they'd all love to be back on that porch, that statement isn't nostalgia. It's neurological. Routine regulates stress. Familiar environments reduce anxiety. The porch wasn't just wood and railings. It was orientation. Now imagine being removed from that orientation overnight. No matter how well-intentioned the intervention may have been, disruption has consequences. And that is why this moment feels heavier than any argument between creators. Because this is the point where real-life outcomes are locked in. Let's talk about safety honestly. Safety does not mean perfection. Safety does not mean modernity. Safety does not mean aesthetics. Safety means absence of active harm. So the debate has become polarized. One side says, they were abused and neglected. The other says, there was no proof of abuse. But here's the nuance that rarely gets space. There is a difference between poverty and abuse. A cluttered home is not automatically neglect. A rural lifestyle is not automatically danger. A nonverbal adult with a scab on his head is not automatically evidence of assault. At the same time, poverty can mask risk, isolation can hide deterioration, and vulnerability can be exploited quietly. Both things can be true. The reason this moment is so fragile is because perception now determines outcome. If the state views the situation as chronic neglect, reunification becomes unlikely. If allegations of coaching and manipulation are proven credible, the removal narrative becomes complicated. If abuse claims are unsubstantiated, reputations suffer permanently. And if abuse occurred but was never properly documented, then justice is incomplete. That's the weight sitting over the Whittaker family right now. It's not about whether someone dumped mud on Timmy for content. It's not about whether someone forced a haircut for a storyline. It's about whether the system believes the original environment was fundamentally unsafe. Because once the system decides that, reversing it is nearly impossible. One of the most powerful statements repeated in this conversation is simple. Nobody ever asked them what they wanted. That critique matters. Autonomy is dignity. When Ray didn't want his mustache trimmed, that preference mattered. When Betty said waxing hurt, that discomfort mattered. When Timmy laughed next to BJ without flinching, that body language mattered. Those small moments are not trivial. They are indicators of relational comfort. People who live in fear often display hypervigilance, flinching, startle responses, withdrawal, chronic stress cues. Viewers watched hours of footage. Did they see those patterns consistently? Or did they see something else? Familiarity, teasing, laughter, routine irritation, everyday family dynamics amplified by cameras? This is where the narrative fractures. Some believe urgency was manufactured. Some believe emergency was real. Some believe coaching occurred. Some believe protection was necessary. And now the consequences are irreversible in the short term. The siblings are not home. Betty does not have the comfort of checking on them nightly. Larry does not know how they are sleeping. That uncertainty alone is psychological punishment. Even if the new placements are objectively cleaner, safer, medically supervised, the emotional toll of removal cannot be dismissed. The porch was not just a setting, it was an anchor. And anchors, once cut, are not easily reattached. There is another uncomfortable dimension. Public pressure can influence institutional response. When hundreds of calls flood agencies, urgency escalates. Agencies become risk-averse. It becomes safer bureaucratically to remove first and sort later. No official wants to ignore potential neglect and be wrong. So what happens when urgency is amplified online? Institutions respond, but institutional responses are blunt instruments. They do not account for nuance. They do not parse YouTube drama. They evaluate risk on paper, and paper rarely captures rhythm. That is why this moment is the hardest yet, because this is no longer about content creators arguing. It is about the permanence of decisions. Once someone enters a structured care system, returning home requires proof of safety, proof of stability, proof of compliance with standards that were never required before. The Whittakers lived 70 years outside intense scrutiny. Now every detail is scrutinized. That shift alone changes everything. And there is a final layer most people aren't discussing. If allegations of coaching are true, if Timmy was guided to say certain things, that undermines credibility. But if coaching did not occur and reports were authentic, dismissing them as scripted is equally harmful. Either way, the truth matters, because the truth determines whether this family is reunified or permanently separated. And right now, the truth is buried under opinion. The hardest moment isn't loud. It's waiting, waiting to see whether removal becomes permanent, waiting to see whether public interest fades, waiting to see whether institutions reassess, waiting to see whether the porch remains memory or becomes possibility again. And that waiting is heavier than any live stream argument. Comment one word: reunite or reform. When families fall under public scrutiny, the loudest argument usually wins. But institutions don't operate on volume. They operate on documentation. And right now, documentation is what decides the Whittakers' future. There's a critical shift that happens the moment authorities intervene in a household. The story stops being emotional and becomes procedural. It's no longer about who feels betrayed, who feels misunderstood, or who believes they were right. It becomes about standards. Minimum standards of care, minimum standards of supervision, minimum standards of safety. If a state agency determines that a home environment fails those standards, even once, the burden flips. It's no longer the agency proving danger. It's the family proving safety. That reversal is enormous. For 70 years, Betty operated without formal oversight. She cooked. She cleaned. She washed clothes daily. She kept routines. She managed medications. She transported siblings to doctors monthly. Whether someone agrees with her methods or not, she was the system. Now she is not. Now there are forms, assessments, reports, case notes, risk evaluations. And here is the part most people don't understand. Once a vulnerable adult enters structured care, the path back is narrow. It requires demonstration of change, improved housing conditions, verified stability, clear boundaries with outside influences, defined caregiving roles, compliance with oversight, even if abuse was never proven, even if neglect was exaggerated. The standard becomes higher than it ever was before. And that's why this moment feels so heavy, because what once was informal is now institutional. Let's address the tension directly. There are two competing narratives about what led to intervention. Narrative 1 says, there were credible concerns of abuse and neglect. That removal was protective and overdue. Narrative 2 says, urgency was manufactured. Allegations were coached, and public pressure triggered an overreaction. Both narratives have traction, but neither narrative alone explains the complexity. The truth often hides in the overlap. It is possible for a home to be imperfect, but not malicious. It is possible for people to exploit chaos without inventing it. It is possible for agencies to act out of caution rather than certainty. And it is possible for everyone involved to believe they were doing the right thing. That's what makes this the hardest moment yet. Because no matter what the origin was, the outcome is separation. Let's talk about the psychology of separation in vulnerable adults. When someone with limited verbal skills is removed from their primary environment, stress responses can spike dramatically. Routine is regulatory. Familiar smells, familiar sounds, predictable voices. They reduce cognitive load. Remove that, and the brain must reorient under stress. Some individuals adapt quickly. Others regress. In the public clips viewers saw, Timmy often appeared relaxed while coloring. Ray often responded predictably to familiar people. Lorraine visibly reacted differently depending on who entered the room. Those reactions were patterns. Patterns matter in care environments. If a new facility does not understand those patterns, behaviors can be misinterpreted. Anxiety may look like defiance. Confusion may look like noncompliance. Silence may be mistaken for contentment. This is why transition planning is critical. And here is a sobering reality. Not every removal includes ideal transition planning. Agencies are overloaded. Resources are finite. Placements are sometimes reactive. So, while some argue that removal equals safety, others worry about a different kind of risk. Institutional misfit. Not abuse, not malice, but mismatch. A system built for compliance, meeting individuals, built around routine familiarity. This is not speculation. It's a documented challenge in adult protective transitions nationwide, and yet the public rarely discusses that dimension. Instead, the debate remains binary. Safe before, unsafe before, victims, not victims, manipulated, not manipulated, but complexity resists binaries. Another overlooked factor is power redistribution. When Betty managed the household, authority was localized, informal, relational. After removal, authority shifts outward. Case managers, state officials, medical providers. That redistribution of power changes everything. Betty can no longer check on Ray's sleep at night. She cannot confirm Timmy's medication timing. She cannot interpret Lorraine's subtle cues. That loss is not symbolic. It is functional. At the same time, agencies now carry legal responsibility. They are liable for outcomes. That liability makes them cautious. Caution often translates into restriction, restricted contact, structured visitation, limited information sharing due to confidentiality laws. For families accustomed to open, constant proximity, that restriction feels punitive, and that perception fuels anger. Anger fuels narrative battles. Narrative battles fuel online escalation, which circles back to the beginning. Public scrutiny complicates institutional decisions. If agencies perceive ongoing public volatility, they may become even more cautious about reunification. Stability is part of assessment. If the environment remains entangled in controversy, that may be interpreted as risk. That's the hidden chain reaction. Public noise can indirectly affect private outcomes. Now consider this. If abuse was indeed fabricated or exaggerated through coaching, then removal is built on unstable ground. But if coaching accusations are themselves deflection, then dismissing reports becomes dangerous. This is why documentation matters more than emotion. Video clips of alleged coaching exist. Interpretations vary. Some see scripting, others see clarification attempts. Context matters. But agencies do not rely on YouTube clips alone. They conduct interviews separately. They evaluate consistency. They assess cognitive capacity. If Timmy repeated allegations in structured interviews, that weighs differently than a single filmed exchange. The public does not have access to that full record, and that absence of visibility breeds speculation. Speculation is combustible. What remains undeniable is this. Once a case reaches this level, returning to the exact previous state is rare. Reunification, if it happens, would likely come with conditions. Home inspections, regular welfare checks, defined guardianship clarity, potential limitations on outside filming. Which brings us to another sensitive element, content. When vulnerable adults become subjects of online storytelling, boundaries blur. Consent becomes complicated. Capacity matters. Financial incentives exist. Some argue exposure brought help. Others argue exposure destabilized everything. Both arguments hold weight. Exposure increased donations. Exposure increased scrutiny. Exposure increased calls to authorities. Exposure is neutral in theory. Its impact depends on execution. Now the family stands in the aftermath of that exposure. And here is the question few are asking. If reunification were offered tomorrow under strict oversight, would Betty accept those conditions? Would she agree to inspections, to documentation, to structured boundaries, to limited outside involvement? Because safety in 2026 looks different than safety in 1996. Standards have evolved. Expectations have shifted. The porch alone may no longer be enough. This is not a moral judgment. It is a regulatory reality. The hardest moment, yet, is not dramatic. It is bureaucratic. Paperwork determines proximity. Assessments determine access. Compliance determines reunification timelines. And while the internet debates motives, agencies assess risk. Meanwhile, the individuals at the center, Ray, Lorraine, Timmy, experience the consequences in silence. The public may never see their current rooms, may never hear their new routines, may never know how they are sleeping. Confidentiality laws protect them from exposure and from reassurance. That uncertainty is uncomfortable, but sometimes protection requires opacity. The final uncomfortable truth of this phase is simple. No matter what narrative prevails online, the next chapter will be written by institutions, not creators. And institutions move slowly. Comment one word that you believe matters most right now: stability, truth, oversight, or family. When a family reaches this level of scrutiny, the fight is no longer just about what happened. It becomes about what can be proven next. And that's where the Whittakers situation turns from emotional to strategic. Because after removal, after investigations, after viral debates and accusations, there is only one path forward that actually changes outcomes. Measurable stability. Not opinions, not loyalty, not who believes whom. Measurable stability. Let's break down what that really means. If Betty and Larry ever hope to regain proximity, influence, or even consistent contact with Lorraine, Timmy, and Ray, the state will not be persuaded by sentiment. It will be persuaded by documentation, housing stability, financial clarity, medical compliance, absence of high-risk individuals, reduced volatility. Every one of those categories becomes a box that must be checked. And here is where the situation becomes delicate. Because the Whittakers' environment has never been simple. It has been layered with poverty, isolation, limited education, addiction history within extended family, outside creators filming, fundraising disputes, and public arguments about who is helping and who is exploiting. From an institutional lens, that is instability, not necessarily criminal instability, but environmental instability, and environmental instability is enough to trigger caution. Now consider the optics. Agencies do not want to remove vulnerable adults and then return them to an environment that looks unchanged. They need to demonstrate progress. Progress must be visible, which means if reunification is ever on the table, the home environment would need to look materially different than it did before. That may include structural repairs, clear sanitation standards, defined sleeping arrangements, medication management documentation, absence of chaotic third-party involvement. That last point matters more than people realize. Third-party involvement. If individuals with public controversies, ongoing disputes, or potential investigations remain heavily connected to the household, agencies may interpret that as ongoing risk exposure. Even if those individuals claim to be helping, perception matters. Documentation matters more. let's talk about the psychological weight of this moment on Betty specifically. For decades, she was the central caregiver. Caregiving becomes identity. It structures your day. It structures your purpose. It structures your sense of worth. When that role is removed suddenly, especially in later life, it can create disorientation. Grief doesn't always look like crying. Sometimes it looks like anger, or defensiveness, or withdrawal. Now imagine grieving while being publicly analyzed. Every statement dissected, every facial expression interpreted, every past decision judged. That pressure doesn't just affect emotions. It affects decision-making. And decision-making right now must be precise, because any public misstep can be used to justify institutional caution. Now, let's address the question that keeps resurfacing in different forms. Were they safe before? Safety is a layered concept. Physical safety, medical safety, environmental safety, psychological safety. It is possible for one layer to be adequate while another is weak. For example, regular doctor visits may indicate medical oversight. Absence of visible injuries may suggest no overt physical abuse. But environmental hazards, structural decay, sanitation issues, lack of formal supervision can still trigger removal under adult protective standards. It doesn't require malicious intent. It requires threshold breach. And that threshold is not determined by public opinion. It is determined by statute. Another critical factor is consistency of narrative. Agencies evaluate whether statements change over time. If allegations were made and then retracted, investigators look at why. Was there coercion initially? Was there coercion afterward? Was there confusion? Was there scripting? Inconsistent statements do not automatically invalidate claims. They complicate them. But complexity does not mean dismissal. And while the public debates coaching versus truth, agencies evaluate credibility using structured methods most viewers never see. Now let's talk about the broader impact. This is not just a family case anymore. It has become symbolic. For some, it represents government overreach. For others, it represents overdue intervention. For others still, it represents exploitation by outsiders. When a case becomes symbolic, resolution becomes harder, because resolution now carries ideological weight. If reunification happens, one side will claim vindication. If it does not, another side will claim validation. But institutions do not move based on ideological wins. They move based on risk mitigation, which brings us to the most sobering possibility. This may not end with full reunification at all. Partial contact, structured visitation, long-term supervised placement. Those outcomes are common in cases involving cognitively vulnerable adults. The public rarely considers that middle ground, because middle ground is not dramatic. It doesn't satisfy either extreme, but it is often the most realistic. Another overlooked element is aging. Betty is in her 70s. Even if no abuse occurred, caregiving at that level becomes physically demanding. Lifting, supervision, medication tracking, emergency response readiness. Agencies factor caregiver capacity into decisions, not just intention, capacity. Can the caregiver physically and cognitively maintain consistent care long term? That question alone can shift outcomes regardless of past controversy. Now layer in external pressure. When cases receive hundreds of calls from concerned viewers, agencies document that too. High call volume indicates community concern. Even if many calls are redundant or based on incomplete information, they become part of the case record. Public urgency becomes institutional documentation. That documentation does not disappear simply because narratives shift later, which means the digital footprint of this controversy will follow the case. That is the hidden consequence of virality. It creates a permanent paper trail, and paper trails influence decisions. Let's consider the possibility that agencies determine reunification is not in the best interest of the vulnerable adults. What happens then? Betty and Larry must redefine their role, from primary caregivers to extended family members with structured contact. That transition is emotionally brutal, but it may be institutionally irreversible. On the other hand, if agencies determine that with oversight the home can meet standards, then strict conditions will likely accompany return. Conditions change power dynamics. No more informal autonomy, scheduled visits, compliance documentation, potential restrictions on filming, possible financial transparency requirements. That last piece is crucial. When donation controversies exist, agencies may scrutinize financial management to ensure funds are not misused or misrepresented. Even if no fraud occurred, oversight can be imposed. Oversight feels intrusive, but it becomes the price of reunification. Now ask yourself this. If reunification requires reduced online presence, less public storytelling, and fewer third-party narratives, will everyone involved accept that? Because safety and spectacle rarely coexist comfortably. The family is facing their hardest moment, yet not because of one allegation or one removal, but because they are at a crossroads between two very different futures. One governed by institutional structure, one defined by informal familiarity, and those futures cannot merge without compromise. The public can debate motives. Creators can debate narratives. Supporters can debate fairness. But the only debate that matters now happens behind closed doors in case reviews and risk assessments. The final question in this phase is not, who was right? It is, what environment can withstand scrutiny? And that question will decide everything that comes next. Comment one word that you believe determines the Whittakers' future right now: capacity, documentation, trust, or change. At some point, every public controversy reaches a quiet phase. Not because the emotions disappear, not because the arguments are resolved, but because the real decisions move behind closed doors. That's where the Whittakers are now. The cameras are no longer the center. The live streams are no longer the battlefield. The comment sections are no longer the deciding factor. What matters now is assessment, and assessment is methodical. When adult protective systems evaluate a case like this long-term, they look at 5 core pillars: environmental stability, caregiver capacity, vulnerable adult functioning, risk exposure, sustainability. Let's walk through them. Environmental stability means more than, is the house standing? It means, are utilities reliable? Is sanitation consistent? Is there safe food storage? Is there structural safety? Is there space appropriate for supervision? This isn't about aesthetics. It's about predictability. Institutions favor environments where nothing unexpected can escalate quickly. Next, caregiver capacity. Even if Betty's intentions were always protective, agencies must ask whether she can physically and cognitively manage ongoing care. Age matters. Fatigue matters. Stress matters. Public controversy matters. Caregiving under pressure is not the same as caregiving in quiet isolation. Then there's vulnerable adult functioning. Lorraine, Timmy, and Ray are not identical in needs. Each has different levels of communication, medical management, and behavioral support requirements. Agencies evaluate whether those needs can be met without specialized structure. And here is where emotion collides with policy. Love is not a substitute for clinical support. Attachment does not replace documentation. Then comes risk exposure. This is the pillar most viewers underestimate. Risk exposure includes who has access to the home, who influences decisions, who handles money, who communicates publicly on their behalf. If that list includes individuals currently under scrutiny, controversy, or investigation, agencies take note, not because guilt is proven, but because risk must be minimized. Finally, sustainability. Even if today looks stable, can stability last? Can the home function 6 months from now? A year from now? 3 years from now? Institutions plan long-term. The public reacts short-term. That difference creates tension. Now, here's the uncomfortable reality. Even if no abuse occurred, even if intentions were never malicious, even if allegations were exaggerated, agencies can still conclude that a different environment provides more consistent safeguards. That conclusion does not automatically equal condemnation, but it does change outcomes, because removal cases often hinge not on proving wrongdoing, but on demonstrating comparative safety. Comparative safety means asking, which environment presents fewer overall variables? If one environment includes structured medical oversight, predictable staffing, and reduced external chaos, while another includes aging caregivers, public controversy, and housing instability, the comparison becomes clinical, not emotional, and clinical decisions feel cold, but they are rarely personal. Now, let's consider the public coaching controversy. If Timmy appeared coached in videos, if statements were rehearsed or interpreted, that detail complicates credibility assessments. Agencies evaluate whether vulnerable adults were influenced in their statements. If they determine coaching occurred, it weakens reliability of those narratives. But here's the twist. Coaching on either side is problematic. If someone coached him to accuse or coached him to retract, both scenarios undermine clarity. And when clarity erodes, agencies lean toward caution. Caution favors containment. Containment favors structured placement. This is where the family faces its hardest truth. They are no longer just defending themselves against allegations. They are competing against structured alternatives. And structured alternatives are difficult to beat unless the home itself evolves. Evolution requires documented improvement, transparent boundaries, reduced volatility, formalized roles, not just promises, not just emotional appeals. Now let's address something else quietly influencing outcomes: public fatigue. When a case generates repeated controversy, creator disputes, donation debates, drug allegations, criminal record accusations, live stream conflict, institutions may view the environment as chronically unstable. Even if the vulnerable adults are not directly participating in the chaos, proximity to chaos matters, because instability can become ambient. Ambient instability increases long-term risk. Now consider the scenario where reunification never happens. What does that look like? Betty and Larry remain family, but not primary caregivers. Contact becomes structured. Visitation may be supervised. Updates may be limited. And the public, which once felt deeply involved, receives less access. That will frustrate some viewers. But confidentiality is not punishment. It is protocol. If reunification does happen, it will likely come with strict conditions, possible restrictions on filming, mandatory medical compliance, financial transparency, routine welfare checks, clear limits on third-party involvement. Those conditions change the dynamic forever. The porch may look the same, but the rules will not. And here is the emotional center of all this. For decades, the Whittakers lived largely unseen. When the world finally saw them, help came, but so did scrutiny. And scrutiny never leaves quietly. Whether they reunite or remain separated, the original life, the one without oversight, without viral debate, without intervention, is gone. That chapter has closed. The next chapter is governed by structure, and structure feels restrictive to people used to autonomy. But structure also prevents collapse. The family is facing its hardest moment not because of one accusation, but because every outcome now carries consequence. Return means oversight. Separation means grief. Public silence means safety but loss of connection. Public involvement means risk. There is no outcome without cost. And that is the quiet truth behind all the noise. So now the question isn't, who wins? It's, what version of stability can withstand scrutiny? Comment one word that describes what you believe matters most in this next phase. Oversight, reunification, structure, or closure.